So one of the threads that connects the two of you is the importance of Indigenous worldviews. So I'm wondering if you could comment about Indigenous culture and beliefs and how they fit within a 21st century education context.
Go ahead.
So there's 2 points that I want to make, and just kind of following up on some of the comments that I've heard about your program. And I know many of you are looking at working with Indigenous communities. And so within the lens of kind of reconciliation and understanding the history and the legacy of Indian residential schools and the impact that that's had on our own education systems within our community, you know, we've got adults, kids who don't know their culture, they don't know their language, myself included. And so the significance, of course, of education can't be understated, but I think it's important to remember that we can't simply be expecting Indigenous communities to adopt a Eurocentric model of education, that in tandem we need to continue to pursue Indigenous education, and that can only occur within a partnership with the communities. And so I guess just thinking about the model that's presented here, ensuring that whatever work is done is done respectfully within the community. And then I guess the other point that I want to make is in terms of not undermining sort of Indigenous worldviews and values, which was done through the Indian residential school system. So I grew up, or I spent my summers with my grandparents in their fishing village, and I had the privilege of witnessing our salmons returning every summer and every fall. And so the river outside of my grandfather's cabin would turn red, literally red, with the backs of salmon returning to spawn. And in my lifetime, which really isn't that long, I've seen this run disappear completely, and we're at a crux in the short history of our lifetime here on this planet. And so there's this report that recently came out by, I think it was the World Wildlife Federation, reporting that in the next 4 years we're expected to lose 60% or 2/3 of our wildlife populations. Our climate is accelerating at an unprecedented, though not unpredicted rate. And in the north, we're experiencing that much more significantly. So on the global scale, even though we've committed to this 1.5 degree change in climate, in the north that still means 5 degrees change, and that has significant impacts. So in terms of incorporating or integrating Indigenous worldviews and the significance of that, what strikes me as relevant is that the lives that we lead, and myself included, they're simply not sustainable. And yet, the laws that govern our activities continue to ignore these immutable laws that govern nature. And so I think the opportunity for the Indigenous voice to really inform how we move forward together in the future is to bring these laws together, because that's what our traditional governance practices and protocols were always intended to do.
Yes.
Martin?
You know, first of all, I mean, you have expressed this far better than I ever could. And I think one of the things those of us who are not Indigenous have got to accept is that it's going to be very hard for us to understand this, and we will never express it as well as you have just done. The fact is that most of us were obviously trained in Eurocentric fashion, where you segment knowledge, and so we understand that you segment it, and never the twain shall meet, and nobody will challenge that. And we'll all sort of say, well, you know, that's really nice, that's pretty, but it's got nothing to do with reality. Except, you know, and then you get scientists, and they certainly won't accept it, unless you're a quantum physicist. If you're a quantum physicist, what you will talk about is the universality of being, just the same way that you have done. A quantum physicist, which is called the mother nature of physics, understands that, in fact, that the segmentation that we talk about, is a segmentation of knowledge that is an ease to knowledge. It is not the way that the world is. The world is interconnected. And that our failure to understand this, and our failure, by the way, to understand that it has to be expressed in Indigenous languages and First Nations languages as opposed to our own, is going to lead us astray. So I think that there is a huge value, and it's a value that is obviously expressed in terms of climate change, but it's also a value that is really necessary to understand when we look at the way the world actually is and the way the world actually works. So that, does it mean that we've got to suddenly stop the Eurocentric way of teaching? I don't think we're going to do that, and I don't think it's necessary. But I will tell you one thing, is we had better understand that Indigenous learning is essential to the understanding of what makes the world tick, and that we will allow it to die at our peril. And I think that's a very important part of I think it's an important part of your life, but I think it has to be an important part of the education system.
So I've got one more question for you, and then we're going to open up to the floor. And I think there are people with microphones, so if you want to ask a question, please put up your hand, and one of the people will come to you. But thinking about the connection between philanthropy and reconciliation, what advice would you give to those of us here in the room about working with Indigenous communities? Who should they reach out to? Who speaks for the community? And how do we learn about the community context when we go in and want to do work with an Indigenous community?
Go ahead.
You've got more experience in the philanthropic
Yeah, but you're
field.
doing a lot better here than I am.
Well, so my first comment would be simply don't reinvent the wheel. There's already a lot of good examples and a lot of good models that I think you can definitely draw from. And I'll admit that I waste a lot of my time reading productivity and efficiency manuals and books from all of these gurus that come out. And you know, there's a lot on how to save money and be a lot more efficient with your time and have meetings through Skype. But when you're building those foundational relationships with Indigenous communities, there's no substitute for actually going into those communities themselves and understanding the conditions and understanding the needs that those communities have. And they're all different and they're all diverse. And I look at my own community, and as far as a nation, we're still a fledgling nation. We've been around as a self-governing nation for the last 20 years, and we're still in our infancy stages as we're sort of understanding how do we bring together both kind of our traditional governance practices within this sort of framework that can be reconciled with sort of the colonial governance framework. And so, and even though we're doing really well, we still really struggle with capacity in our community. We've got engineers, we've got lawyers, way too many lawyers in my opinion. We've got scientists, we've got artists, we've got just this incredible wealth of people to do the work, and yet we're still struggling with substance abuse, we're still struggling with suicides, we're still struggling with poverty in our community. And so our government is continually torn with prioritizing education and prioritizing how do we just ensure that our children want to live. So there's no substitute that you can make. There's no way that you can not have that kind of connection unless you go to those communities.
I don't think you're going to get a better answer than that, by the way. So, what you have said, just ever so politely, is, for God's sake, get off your seat and go talk to somebody. I mean, that's really what it's all about. And I'm always amazed when I go to some of these communities and people ask that question, and you'll get a community side by side, and there's a reservation 5 miles away. And they don't know anybody in the reservation, and they don't know how to do it. And it's exactly what you said. I'm going to, if I could just, I'll tell a story which is an analogy. It doesn't answer your question, but I think it actually does, about talking to somebody. Our business course is in a number of schools across the country, public schools. One of them is Gordon Bell High School. If anybody here is from Winnipeg, they know the Gordon Bell High School. And Gordon Bell High School is, it is a school with a 20% First Nations population, and then the other 80%, there's not a Jones or a Smith around it. It's everybody from all over the world is at this school. And there was an enormous amount of tension between the Chinese kids with the Korean kids, with the African kids, nobody got along with the First Nations kids. And this was a huge problem in the school. And our business course went into it. And I was supposed to go address the assembly to open up the business course. And anyway, but I got a message from the principal saying, look, maybe you should come a little later because the tension's really high. So fine, I said, I'll come whenever you want me to. So about a year and a half later, I went to the school. She called, said you can come, and I went to the school. And I said to her, as we were just chatting in her office, I said, how's the tension? How's the problem? She's gone. Everything was really working out well. And I was sort of surprised, and I said, isn't that wonderful? You got to tell me how to do it. And she said, I will, but we've got to go into do the assembly. So we do. The kids are, 1,200 kids are lined up against the back of the gym over there, and then I'm on a stage, something like this, and I walk in, and I walk by here, and there are 13 girls in all First Nations drumming group. I've never seen an all-girl drumming group before. And they were tremendous. They were drumming away and they were doing everything else. And I stood. I asked them if I could join them, and they said no. And then all of a sudden, so then I turned away to go towards the mic, and there was a crash. And then I looked over the other side of the room, and this was an African drumming group, kids primarily from Eritrea and Ethiopia, and they were pounding away. And then all of a sudden, I noticed something. The girls would rise in tone, and the Africans would drop in tone. And then the African group would rise in tone, and the girls would drop. And I'm tone deaf, and even I could tell that, in fact, they were making music together. It was spectacular. So when it came time for me to speak to the kids, I was supposed to answer the kids' questions. And I said, I'm not going to answer their questions. I'm going to ask them. So a small Chinese girl came up to the mic, and she said, Mr. Martin, I said, I'm going to ask you a question. I said, how are you getting along with these African kids? She were getting along well. So I said, how are you getting along with these First Nations kids? They must be a pain in the neck, talking about this is their country. And she said, Mr. Martin, we came to their country. They opened their doors to us. We're building this country. Mr. Martin, don't you understand Canada? Said she. So then the next person up was, and I think that accused the principal of having it set up. And the next person that came up was a young First Nations kid. And so I said to him, I said, hey, you know, my family's been here for 300 years. And I don't understand why we have to accept all these people who are coming over now, right? And the kid just said, Mr. Martin, your family's been here for 300 years. Mine's been here since time immemorial, and you're lucky I let you in. And then he went into a huge defense of what these kids were doing. It was a wonderful exhibition. So I asked, and this goes really to your thing, I asked the principal, I said, what in God's name did you do? How did you turn this around? And she said, it was one of our teachers came to see us. One of our teachers came to see me because the tension was really boiling up. And she said, he said that we should do this. And so what would happen is, one Monday morning, the teacher and I would walk down the corridor, or noon, I'm sorry, when the kids were coming out for their lunch. And she'd see them all coming down. So she'd see 3 First Nations kids coming by. And she'd grab them, and they'd shove them into an empty classroom. Say, you're in there for an hour, stay there. And then a couple of Chinese kids would come along, grab them, shove them into the classroom. A couple of African kids would come along, shove them into the classroom. And they did this until they got about 20 kids in the classroom, and they just let them stew for an hour. For an hour. Then they let them out. And of course, what happened is these kids started talking to each other. Next day, they did the same thing, exactly the same thing. They went down the corridor. They would grab these kids, shove them in, different kids, shove them into the room. The third day, they did the same thing. And then by the 4th day, what they noticed was the kids started walking down the corridor in groups of 2s and 3s, hoping to get grabbed and to put in. She told me that within 2 weeks, because these kids, when they went in, what are you going to do in an empty classroom with a bunch of other kids? You're going to talk to them. And that's what they did. They talked to each other. And within 2 weeks, the tension in the community had dropped. And she said, we've never had people come together this way. And they were all learning each other. And that's what you said. And so my thing is, maybe what we should just simply do is take Canadians and shove them into a classroom alone for a while.
So do we have any questions from the audience? I see one at the back. Looks like Susan Mann. Is it Susan? No, we've got a microphone coming to you.
First off, I think I asked someone yesterday, I can't remember who it was in the room at one of the receptions last night, what should we do? So this has been amazing, so thank you. But it struck me in listening to Mr. Martin's discussion about the program in the schools and how well students did, that you said it was in 6 schools and it's getting rolled out. But it seems in this time of reconciliation, and particularly with the emphasis, why aren't we doing it in all the schools? And I'm thinking, given your previous roles in life and your familiarity, how can we get governments to just do this instead of waiting for pilot projects? I'm just curious, because I agree that education is key. I would think that education is key, and I just think it's so amazing. Why are we waiting? Why isn't it everywhere?
Well, so we did it in these 2 schools and funded it in these 2 schools, and it's actually not inexpensive. And then what happened, so the results were then came out, and the results were published from these 2 schools. We went to the new government, and we essentially said, made exactly the point that you did, that we've got to basically do this. And so the agreement that was made, it was announced in the budget, was that we would do 18 schools over the next 5 years. 6 this year, and then 6 again in 2 years, and then the other 6 the following years. And there are 2 reasons for it. One, it is expensive, but the big area is there are no trainers. And so what's important to us is to use this time to train the trainers, so that we can then, because the limitation, apart from cost, the limitation is really the trainers who can teach how to teach literacy. In fact, what we're really doing in many ways is we're doing teacher training. That's why it's so important for us to train the trainers in terms of teacher training. And I think this is a huge need, and I'm sure others are doing it, but I think we're one of the very few groups who fully embarked on the question of teacher training. And that is the limitation. You've got to build up the trainers. Now, the trainers. It is my hope that as we succeed in doing what we're doing, that in fact, that somewhere in the middle of these 18, we'll be able to open it up to many more schools. So, and then it will take off. I would just say one thing. I really do believe, and we talked about this at our discussion group at just before this meeting, it's very hard for government to do pilot projects. It's very hard for governments to fail. And I think that one of the roles that foundations can play which is incredibly important, is the ability to do pilot projects and to basically show that success can come. And then basically, but I don't think that, most foundations aren't going to fund things for the next 100 years. And this is the responsibility of government. And you're absolutely right. And I will say that my own belief in terms of the Canadian people, that it's one thing to set objectives. It's one thing to make the argument, and the argument, very clearly, in my opinion, is that $1 spent on education gives you the highest return. And as a Minister of Finance, I think I can vouch for this. $1 spent on education will give you the highest return of any investment that a government can make. And so that it is justifiable, but you really got to show success. You've got to show Canadian success. That's absolutely crucial. If we can show success in this next 18 schools, I believe that there's no way that any government will want not to proceed with it. I think your question is a good one, but there's your answer.
Can I respond? I just wanted to add to that as well. And I think it's absolutely critical that, yes, we show success with these pilot projects, and there's definitely an opportunity for philanthropy to kind of fill that role that's not necessarily being filled by the government. But I think there's sort of a subverted undertone here, and I think this is part of the uncomfortable reality that we're going to have to face as Canadians as we sort of walk this path of reconciliation, is recognizing that there are definitely attitudes rooted in the legacy of colonialism that undermine the value of Indigenous education and of Indigenous peoples. And we see it not just in education, we see it in the judicial system, we see it in our water systems, we see it in basically every facet of our lives. And I think that just reflects the lack of value that the governments and the people making these decisions over our communities have for our lives. And I'll stop there.
Now, can I just add to that? I think there is a change that has occurred. I don't know if it was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but I brought in the Cologne Accord. The Cologne Accord was the first time in the history of the country that the federal government, federal prime minister, the premiers, and the Indigenous leadership had met around a table and had come to an agreement. And we came to an agreement on a framework. And I'm not trying to get into the politics here, but as you know, that the Cologne Accord was not carried through with. There was not a Canadian in the country who said one thing. They just let it happen. That would not happen today. Something over the course of the last 10 years has, and I'm giving, I think, the TNRC a lot of the credit. Something has happened. There is a change of attitude that is phenomenally important that I have never seen before in my life. And I think, just based on what you have said, if we miss this change, then we are really going to be doing such a terrible disservice to our children. But boy, if we take advantage of it, I think that there will be no end. This is not just a social issue. This is the hugest economic issue in the country. God, for the first time in the history of this country, there are more people over the age of 65 than there are under the age of 15. You want to know what the future looks like? Take a look. So for heaven's sakes, how can we possibly allow the youngest and the fastest growing segment to continue along being undereducated, under health care, not provided with decent water? I'll tell you, immoral, yes it is, but it's also just as dumb as a bag of hammers economically.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions? Vicki?
I have one question, and the question is...
There's a microphone coming to you.
How do you know everyone in the room?
I know a lot of people.
Okay. The question I have is, the programs that you're running, the primary school programs are all on reserves, right?
Yes, except for the business course. The business course is on and off reserve.
So the business course is on and off reserve. I wanted to clarify that, because I just wanted clarity on that, just because I think when we talk about education, I think it's going to be, how do you deal with the urban programming, and because that is I think that's a real challenge, and I'd like to hear you speak on, the Indigenous kids who are in the cities and towns and where they're still exposed to the same kind of prejudice and racism that...
You want to answer that? Go, start.
So sorry, you're asking about how do we start to address kind of urban Aboriginal education? And I think, from my perspective, I think that's almost a bigger challenge, because we have children who have been uprooted from their communities, and they don't have access to their land base. They don't have access, sort of direct access to their culture and their communities. And so that's almost an even larger challenge from my perspective. And honestly, education isn't my field, and I don't understand it, but I think what would have assisted me when I was younger and I left my community and I graduated high school in Vancouver was, one, having the structure and having the context provided for me to, one, understand sort of the nature. I mean, it took me a long time I wasn't that sophisticated of a teenager, and it took me a long time to kind of articulate my experience around what racism looked like, what power and privilege looked like, how that changed the dynamics within the high school that I was at, and how it influenced how I thought of myself. I had a really low self-esteem, and it took me a long time to go through this, to kind of graduate through that because of the experience, the racism that I experienced as a child. So I think having structured support available for our kids, and then also providing the context, and not just to our kids, but within the curriculum in general, to understand the legacy of colonialism, to understand the impact that has and that it continues to have, and the opportunity that's there, not just to kind of for us to move forward as sort of a moral authority on the globe, but as Mr. Martin has stated, this is an economic issue. If you want to make kind of an economic argument, then this is it. You know, drawing down social services and welfare services is a disservice to our country. And so how do we change that, and how do we shift that? And it's fundamentally investing in our education and in our youth.